Hey, I'm Hiko, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Daring Minds, the Valorant talk show starring me and Gio, for people who don't have eyes and apparently can't read the screen. I guess in theory it's possible you could have clicked on and then immediately gone in game and started doing it. I doubt it. I don't imagine you have the fucking wherewithal to do two things at once, Suez. What, except invest in, like, fucking bad crypto coins and then get ripped off or whatever. You can barely do that all the way up the wazoo. So our guest for this one, that's right, I've gone again with a bit of a deep pull here. If you don't know, Achilios here lives in Korea, has lived there for many years now, and casts VCT Korea, so it's going to be a Korean themed episode. But also, if people don't know, he has a longer history of that in esports. He was actually also doing League of Legends in Korea over previous years and Overwatch, and was obviously part of the Overwatch community. He was even in LA at one point in time. He was one of those people who went on that little adventure. So he's someone, again, with a multi-game background, but he's in Valorant now. Now, look, as I made this point on past episodes, we're never going to pretend like we watch all the regions. Like, I actually found in a lot of games when people do that, it doesn't help. Like, you can't, remember, here's the problem, it's not a 5-minute interview. You can't fake your way through. It's a 2-hour conversation. Like, if we really don't watch the game, it's going to be exposed like 2 minutes in. There's no amount of crib notes in the world. So Gio doesn't pretend to watch every VCT Korea game. She watches the games she watches, and the idea is, if she has some insight, she knows some players, she'll talk about it while we talk about it. Otherwise, we'll both use this as a learning episode. And one thing I thought would be cool was there's a lot of actual, like, intangibles and culture related things I think people would be interested in about Koreans, that if you're just a fan coming from either CSGO, where we barely had Koreans, or even games like League of Legends where you maybe know about them but you don't know how they work in FPS games, that might be a lot of interesting topics. I thought we could go around and discuss things, because, for example, an obvious thing, I won't spoil it now but I'll tease it, is no one thinks about it now, mate, but all I do, Achilles, is I just look at Zyra play and I keep watching him all the time, and I keep watching him getting better and better, and I'm just thinking what none of them are thinking, mate. I'm just going, when do all the other imports come in? But they haven't got that far yet, Achilles. That's for later in the episode. They still haven't figured that out. They still really believe when this becomes like an LCS, it's going to be all Wardell in that play, like then fucking boomers from CSGO. They don't understand what's coming because they haven't followed Overwatch, unfortunately, so they don't know about the onslaught. So we'll get to that later. That's a teaser. It's like I teased the end of like fucking Infinity War for you or something. So just wait, it's all right.
The reckoning is coming.
Yeah, come all the way back to the beginning. And now it's just a tiny little region with some, really diligent players trying their darndest, and they're just, maybe one day they get to Masters and maybe they'll make an impact one of these days. So let's start here though, Achilles. One thing that was a piece of news people will have seen, even if they don't follow VCT Korea, is that you guys got to have a rarity now, an audience. You got to have an audience for the finals, which obviously, if people don't know, even the Masters tournament won't have that when it's in Iceland. So what was this like to have one of those setups? Because again, maybe you can relate it. Like, how was it compared to some of the League of Legends finals you've been to? Because if people don't know, when it would be like a big League of Legends final, they would typically rent out like, sort of warehouse type place, but they would put like 10,000 people in here. They would just put like 1 million of those plastic chairs. And so those crowds were very legit. Like those weren't like fake crowds with people coming off the street. Those are like real fans. So what has it been like for Valorant in that sense? What was it like having a crowd event and a proper stadium event, etc.?
It's been fantastic because all of us here, and I'd say that pretty much any caster in the world who's been working since before 2020, they miss having that live audience. We were fortunate enough to, have a studio even through all of last year. But obviously no audience there. Now we've shifted over. We've gotten the S-Plex Center, the Sangam Coliseum, whatever you want to call it, the OGN studio.
Yes, there you go.
And we're working out of there. And I was talking with Riot Korea and I was saying, we've got this studio. It's perfect for an audience. When are we going to have this happen? They're like, we're hoping to have it by playoffs. And luckily it ended up working out. There's no.
What is the capacity of that place then? Like, I'm guessing like 1,000 or something?
So we only sold the 15th floor. We didn't sell the 16th floor, which is the nosebleeds. I forget if you've ever been there in the past, but so we didn't sell the upper level. That was reserved for kind of like special guests, players who had fallen out of the tournament if they wanted to come watch the finals live. It was reserved for those people. But so that bottom seating, without selling the wings of it, because it's really awkward to try to see the main screen. It's about 350 to 400 people on that bottom level. And then if you take the upper level into consideration, it's like another 200. So not quite 1,000, but you can fill it to capacity and get a bit over 600, I believe. Okay.
Have any of the events you've done, by the way, Gio, actually had a crowd yet in Valorant?
No, the only in-person thing I did in Valorant was Masters 3, and there wasn't a crowd for that.
That was the one in Berlin,
Everything
right?
else, that was the one in Berlin. Everything else that I've done has been online. Because even when I was on EMEA, they did some stuff like in the studio, but it's only the analyst desk who go there. And even now, it's only the analyst desk who go there, not the casters. And I was on the analyst desk like once or twice, but I was mostly casting that.
Fair enough. Yeah, to be fair, if I'd have known it was only in Germany, I wouldn't even have wasted my time asking if there was a fucking crowd. Enough said, boom, boom. Everyone knows my feelings about Germans. Right, so here's my question, Gio. To set up the episode, as I said, I sort of spoke for you there, but I want to get your thoughts, right? Because unfortunately, I've become like the fucking annoying people that I hate on Twitter. I've got a parasocial relationship with Gio, where you think because of this show, like I know it. I barely know, I've done a few shows and that's it. But because I made the mistake, like I did with loads of people on esports and following them on Instagram, I've now essentially, it's like I'm being onslaughted by all their inner thoughts and their like fucking their insecurities and the things they worry about and one day what they think, and then so like I actually feel a bit thrown off because I like to just sort of keep people at a distance, you know, and gradually get to know them. So even though this makes no sense, right, I actually happen to know just from passively consuming this shit that Gio is one of these people who just for funsies like learns Korean and like writes shit out and was like, and don't you want to like go, wasn't your dream to go to Korea at some point in time?
So back like pre-COVID I was like I really, really wanted to go to Korea, and not that I don't want to go to Korea anymore.
It's just a little trickier, obviously.
I was really hoping to go in 2020, which obviously didn't end up being a thing. And yeah, I was learning Korean for a little while, but that was a combination of I was interested in the country, but also like I'm a big languages person. Like I also study German. I've studied German for most of my life. So I just really, really love languages. But I thought that would be a cool one. I was learning Japanese when I was a teenager, and it's a very similar structured language. And so before I started working full time in Rainbow Six, I had a lot of time on my hands. So I was doing a lot of studying for that, but then basically as soon as I started working in Rainbow Six, I just didn't have the time to do it anymore. But I do still have like all of my notes and shit like that, so they're lying around. But yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, by the way, just for the reason, what was the reason why? Like, did you actually, like, look, it's a very classic story. Did you envision it as, like, the mecca of esports and, you know, the streets are paved with fucking boxer signatures? So, did you have that dream? Did you have the dream?
There were a couple of different reasons. So, actually, like, when I was younger, I always wanted to go to Hong Kong. I always liked the idea of going to one of these massive, like, populated Asian cities. I've never been to Asia, and I really like big cities. And then when I got more and more into esports and I was working more in esports, it kind of made sense that like actually Seoul would be the city that I would be more likely to go to and get more out of. And also like at the time I was in a relationship with someone who worked into Korea a couple of times over the course of the time that we were together, and I would see like the fun that he would have. I'm pretty sure actually like Seth, you might have met him on some of those trips. And yeah. And I would be sat at home and I'd be like, what the fuck, man? Like I want to be there.
FOMO, yeah.
I had FOMO, really badly. And I was like, you know what? Fuck it. I'm going to pay and go on my own trip to go go to Korea. And then COVID happened, so I never got to go on that trip, unfortunately. So that's, I suppose, postponed.
The good news is like now
you can finally go again now.
Starting today, like if you're just vaccinated, you don't need to quarantine.
They've removed the exemption in theory now.
Oh my god. Okay.
You can just enter the country.
Korea 2022, 2023. It's happening.
Also, coincidentally, even though it has nothing to do with it, actually one of the main news websites in Korea is indeed called FOMO. Little detail for people there. Straight fire reference. There you go. Technically, I've cheated on that one there, but don't worry about it. Listen, I'm like a rapper. You just fucking curve the word at the end. What? Rhymes? What are your notes? Like, yeah, okay, mate. Fucking sound and sand rounds. Yeah, all right. Right, here's what we do at the beginning. So, like I say, at any point, we can go on tangents. We can do all that stuff. Let's just start with, obviously, like, we want to know about VCT Korea. So, Achilios, if people don't know, first things first, I'm assuming my assumption on this episode is some people will only know about the Vision Strikers streak from fucking ages ago now, but that still feels in their mind like it was recent. Maybe Nocturne Gaming and going to the fucking Masters, and that's about it. I don't expect them to know anything else, so I'm treating it like that, as though that's all they know about Korea. So first things first, there is no Vision Strikers. It's called DRX now, which is one of the top Korean orgs if people don't know. Whereas this is a key detail, actually, I can already get into the side tangent. I'll quickly say it now. One of the key things you need to learn when you follow Korean esports is not how good the team is in the server, because that's actually irrelevant to the politics. tactics. You need to know how good the organisation is. Because whenever it's like, this always happens at the beginning of the games. At the beginning of the esports games, the top orgs don't just rush into the game. They wait and see how it's going to be and how Korean people pick the game up. So it means that when you get teams like Lunatic High in Overwatch, Vision Strikers in this game, that actually means they're not the top orgs. They're just the people who sort of gambled first and got a good team. But it's inevitable if you wait long enough, if the game gets big enough, people that have the millions and millions will come in and they will just buy these teams. So DRX now has Vision Strikers, although it's not quite that simple, because King actually plays on Slayer's team, which is the other team that's their main rival. And by the way, you know the Return Gaming team? That doesn't exist anymore. And literally 2 of the players are bloody coaches for these teams now. So, like, the Korean scene has had, like, a very interesting recent period. But let's start there. So DRX, Vision Strikers, they are on top again. And coming into the playoffs, they were your favourite. I saw you said, actually, I mean, you were probably joking, but you had them as, like, the team to win everything. Like, how good is DRX?
They're really fucking good. You know, they've always been this team that when they, you know, even from last year when they had that massive streak, like even if somebody pushed them close or took a game off them, because there was a period of time where we had like the weird, you know, best of 2 system. If they had lost a series to somebody, like they came back and they were fierce. So that has kind of been the case for this squad the whole time that they've existed in the Valorant scene. And they started off this year looking incredible. They started going for map picks that they normally did not. So they're going for Ascent, which was typically one that they would want to avoid. They're going for Breeze a lot. So it was kind of showing this new look of DRX with the return of Zest as their IGL as well. And they were just looking really, really dominant. It wasn't until they got to Onslayers the first time in the round robin that they were tested. And I mean, they completely fucking failed the test. They were destroyed 0-2. I think it was 13-4 was like the one scoreline that they had on Icebox. It was not even close. But I knew going into the playoffs, like it's going to be the inevitable rematch of those 2 teams, both in the upper bracket final, then also in the grand final. It played out exactly that way. And I knew that DRX was going to prep for that so incredibly hard because they do not like to lose. They are a team that will absolutely grind and focus on bouncing back. And that's what they did. They did it in a more convincing way than I even anticipated. I thought that it could have been a 5-map series, or at least a 3-1, but they just wiped the fucking floor with Onslayers. They didn't even give them an opportunity to breathe. After they, you know, bested them on Haven, it went into OT on the very first map. It seemed like that loss just cost Onslayers all of their energy, all of their focus, and it just fell apart from there. DRX just were unrelenting. They're not a team who's like, oh, let's have a little bit of showmanship. Let's make it look close or anything like that. Like, let's screw around for this round right here. Like, we'll do a rush out of nowhere,
fan service or something.
They don't take those risks. They will just play concisely and focused until the very end. Like, they're just unforgiving. They're not merciful whatsoever.
Okay. So by the way, Gio, when that whole like Vision Strikers thing was going on last year, because if people don't remember, it actually killed the whole narrative because they had this insane streak and then they didn't even bloody qualify to the Masters thing, did they? Because they got upset by the solo Perry team, which, as I said, they're now coaches. So what were you? Did you follow that team at all? Were you interested in that storyline? Was the return game a surprise for you?
Around the time that I started really getting into Valorant properly. So that was kind of the storyline I was introduced to, right? Like around the time of Masters 2, where it was like, oh, here's the team who've gone to Masters. By the way, there's this other like really sick team that should have. So I sort of came into that looking at it retrospectively. But I think still, like, regardless of the fact that I wasn't necessarily there, like during the period of Vision Strikers doing that, like I still could have an appreciation for what that actually was and how impressive that was. But I think the really interesting story that came from that for me was like, you know, when it really got to the proper, like, you know, meat and bones of like having real international competition, like it brings in this idea that you can be a really dominant force domestically, but like, how does that actually translate to an international stage? And then obviously Vision Strikers were actually there at Masters 3 when I was working the event, and did really well. But again, like it was constantly this sort of from between then and Champions, because in Champions, they didn't actually qualify out of their group. So that's sort of like, it's almost like a story of like resilience, I think, that, you know, from my perspective of like how the Vision Strikers like timeline went over the course of 2021.
Sure. By the way, Achilios, that team, the Vision Striker squad, obviously it's slightly different, only slightly from the squad now. Was that actually, like, for real, one where the Turn Gaming was better when they qualified through, or do you actually think that was like, sort of like Vision Strikers fucked up and they maybe could have done more if they'd gone to that particular Masters?
No, I think that was Vision Strikers really fucking up. That was the really strange hiccup, and the only one that we've seen so far from their play overall, where it seemed like they didn't have a good read on the game. They've been a team that is very ingenuitive, and they're very quick to adapt to new metas and whatnot, but they were showing a lot of resilience when it came down to shifting over to the predominant meta, which was, a lot of Viper. If you looked around at other parts of the world, they weren't running that. And instead of trying to pick up something new, they actually ended up reverting back to their old strategies, which was kind of like the flash and dash, just having that breach and Jett. Whereas in the weeks prior, when they were still finding success, like RB was playing a lot more Raze,
right?
And he was looking fantastic as a Raze. So they just completely reverted to their old setup, and they were not looking like they were willing to budge and show any kind of flexibility in their composition. They just kind of ran it into the ground. And NewTurn was like, well, we know exactly how you play this because you've been doing this for so very long. Like, they just understood exactly what Vision Strikers is going to be trying to do round over round, and then NewTurn just kind of counteracted it perfectly. I think it was very much Vision Strikers dropping the ball, refusing to innovate and kind of move with the times, or even just change up the playstyle of that comp. They didn't come up with anything new. So there was no real surprises, and NewTurn was just able to be the better team, at that time. And I think that NewTurn made a very respectable run that nobody at all anticipated from them in, getting a third place at that first Masters event.
Sure. Gio, is there any players on this team that you've seen that were interesting or they stood out in any way?
Yeah, I mean, the player who I was a really big fan of was always Stax because, like, his breach play was really fun. And actually, the thing I'm really excited about the upcoming Masters is now a lot of other teams in other regions, like NA and EU, are playing a lot more breach than they were towards the end of last year. And I want to see how those two things match up, and if Stax is still going to be spoken about as like the star breach player even on the international stage, which he very much was like towards the end of last year, or if there are like other players from other regions that are going to kind of outshine him in a sense. Like, that's probably going to be something I'm really interested in, because I always thought that he was, he was always the player I was the most interested in on the team.
How would he compare how would he compare to like the people who play his equivalent role in the West, Achilios? How good is this player supposed to be?
I mean, he's actually changed up his style a little bit more as of late. Like, he's playing a much more supportive style rather than an aggressive breach, which is kind of what we saw from him last year. But I mean, last year he was one of the best, just like IGLs and anchors for a team that I've ever seen. Like, he could just keep that team grounded, and if they did get pushed to the point of, he's the last man standing, or it's a 2v5 or something, Stax is typically good for 3 kills in that moment. You just need the other person who's alive with you to come up with 1 or 2 more, and then suddenly the round is won. His clutch factor is absolutely through the roof. And I think that actually right now, everybody on the team averages around like a 24 to 28% clutch rate or whatever. So whenever they are put into a position with the last member alive on the team, everybody on the roster has a 25
that seems very high
chance of closing out. Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous, but they also don't get put in to those situations so much regionally.
Yes,
so
sure,
you take it with a grain of salt.
Right.
But I'd say last year, like, Stax was by far and away the best breach in the world. I would still say that, the Koreans had a couple players who were individually the best at their particular role. Bunny being on Raze is one that I will argue till the end of time. Stax being on breach is another one that's right
Bunny
up there.
on Raze is like an icon.
Every time I'm watching Bunny, it feels like I'm just tripping on like LSD or some shit, because he's just doing wacky stuff, and I can't really wrap my brain around like what the hell he's doing and how he moves the way that he moves. But he just has that character nailed down pat. Hopefully he returns one day. But going back to your question, like, I would still put Stax up there right now in the upper echelons of breaches. Obviously, I need to see a little bit more with him going up against international teams to see if he still is that solidified number 1 spot in my head. Just because he has played a bit more of I was going to say laid back style, but that's not correct, but a little bit more of a disconnected style where he's not like charging in. He's playing a lot more supportive. He's making sure that he's enabling his teammates. And I think that's a big reason why we see DRX being so clean and so methodical, is because they're just focusing on set plays and making sure that everybody's empowering everybody else at a given time. No one's going off and just trying to kill like 3 or 4 people. You know, occasionally you'll have your rush player, whatever, RB goes with the sheriff and kills 3, and it's just like, okay, I don't know how that happened, but if you zoom out, it's because the utility setup from the rest of the team is really enabling him to get into that aggressive position, and then he's just hitting his shots. Sure.
Yeah, if people don't know, so what I thought we'll do is, it's going to be a bit obnoxious if it's just me and Gio asking questions about all the teams, so I'll spread it out. What we'll do is we'll do like a Korean related topic in between each team. That way we have a time to keep it like a nice comfy convo. So we'll stick on DRX for the moment. In DRX, if people don't know, Stax and RB were actually CSGO players. They played for the MVP PK team, which was the top Korean team for the last few years of the game. But the key thing is, if you know what I just said earlier about organizations, MVP is a classic example of a starter org that what they do is they get in every new game, they scout some talent, they usually have a couple of coaches from some other game, they get like an early good team, but spoiler, they always are the one that have to yield if the scene ever becomes big. So in CSGO, tells you what CSGO was, that it never got big in Korea, basically. It was still always like a niche game. So these players played for that team, but if people don't know, they weren't actually the best players. Like the Stax guy was pretty decent in the team, but the best player, if people don't know, was actually not even in Korea right now. It's Zeta, who obviously plays in VCT NA on Cloud9, right? That was actually the best Korean CSGO player. But they have a couple who were from CSGO, and the interesting detail about their team as well to me is they're actually a team where their coach, Termi, was also the coach of this MVP team in CSGO, and himself a 1.6 player, actually. And in fact, those players I referred to earlier, so the coaches also of the other rival teams, Damwon and Onslayers, they're also 1.6 players who were coaches. So the interesting detail is, even though as we get into the episode, people are probably going to be surprised to find out how small Valorant potentially is in Korea, and that it might not become a big game, it's not actually that much to worry about, though, because what I would say is this, is you're actually going to get an inversion of what happens in League of Legends. So in League of Legends, if you compare the regions NA and Korea, it's night and day. Korea's about 1,000 times better, and I'm not exaggerating and hyperbolizing with 1,000.
Yes.
But if you're the best NA team, you could actually at least have a chance. You could be a dark horse against the Korean team. So in the same sense, I expect whoever the best Korean team is to actually often be a potential dark horse for the Western events, but I don't think they'll be the best. And part of the reason I say why is because one of the things I noticed in CSGO that Koreans really struggled with is because they didn't have any ability to practice the Westerners, they developed their own internal meta, and their meta was often too different to the Western meta, unfortunately. So the difference is when you have people who were old school coaches who actually have experience of like how to transition what you do domestically to international, who even will have the connections, by the way, to sort of boot camps and stuff. That's actually how you get your top teams to be at a comparable level. You won't ever get the whole scene to be, because you have to essentially have all the Koreans just decide tomorrow they love Valorant, and spoiler, that doesn't look like it's going to happen at the moment. But to me, it's actually key in these games. You see it, and obviously even in NA and EU, like the coaching and the people with the people coming over from CSGO, at least in the early days, it's going to give you some help getting up to speed and figuring out FPS games, etc.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
I mean, having Solo and Perry both move into coaching roles, Glow stepping back last year, I think it's been really, really great in creating, a multi-team region, I suppose. It's everyone always likes to say, oh, it's just one team. It's only Vision Strike. It's only DRX. It's the only good team that's out there for Korea. I mean, not the case. They're still definitely on top, but I take a look at Onslayers and, on their best day, which definitely was not what was shown in the final, like they absolutely can contend with just about anybody out there. Bazzi is one of the most incredible Jett players in the world right now. So if you get him and the rest of the team fired up, they can take series off of just about anybody. That's the thing with Valorant right now. It's like there is no clear winner. The 2 finalists from last year are not going to Masters. The winner of that first Masters from last year is not in attendance. Yes. Things are very much still in turmoil. It's going to take, I think, a very long while, if it ever happens, where you see team really start to become streaky, such as NIP, such as Astralis and whatnot in CS. I don't know if that will ever necessarily occur, just because there's a lot more going on with Valorant. There's more changes. There's new agents being added to the game and whatnot consistently. So it's really difficult to try and predict like if anybody really could have that level of dominance. But yeah, I mean, I think that the impact of Termi being there and then Glow shifting over, being a positional coach, has done wonders for DRX. Because Glow, I think he could still have. He
was mega, mate. I saw him in the early games. He looked good.
Yeah, he still has it for a guy who's 34 years old, which is really up there for FPS games, especially in Korea. But he just was like, okay, you know what? We have these players that we want to grab. They get Mako, they get Buzz, they take 2 Jett mains, they convert one to being a smoker. Buzz continues to play Jett for last year, and he just works with them as a positional coach, and it paid off extremely well. I think that like for a first year in a tactical FPS for Korea to do what they did last year, I think that that's somewhat satisfying. It would have been a lot better, obviously, if they had made it out of their groups and champions, if they had been able to take down Cloud9. I think it would have been a hell of a lot better. But I'm still proud of what the region said, because there's so many people, obviously, a lot of it's just shit talk and shit posting, but people saying like Koreans can't aim, they don't play FPS games,
yes.
blah, blah, blah.
There's a lot of stereotypes.
But again,
like that,
you go ahead, you point back at the Saya player, you tell them like, this is what is possible when you have Koreans who are focused on FPS. You can't disregard them. You also can't disregard people who come from Overwatch. Like, those players know how to fucking aim, and if you disrespect them and you continue to ignore them, they are going to creep up on you and suddenly take over the game. I think that, you know, the Termi Glow combination has just been magical. I'm hoping for more from Jamin and Perry on the side of Onslayers, and unfortunately for Solo, I don't know what the fuck is going on with Damwon Kia. They just shat the bed in their series versus Holy Moly is the best way that I can put it. And now they've dropped a couple players from the roster. So it seems like Solo's saying like, okay, we need to retool all of this. And he's doing that. I can only hope that it works, because I know that Damwon has the potential to be a top 3. I thought they were going to be maybe the second best team in the region this year. They absolutely are in that upper echelon, and they can compete internationally. They just need to find out like what the fuck their identity is going into stage 2.
When did you start in Overwatch, Gio? What was like the first year you were really covering it and trying to work in it?
2018.
So that was like the...
It was the first year of the Overwatch.
The first year of OWL, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
so what do you think on this? I'll let you start this topic then. That is a very famous stereotype that, even though by this time we'd already had Apex, was still sort of lingering around Overwatch. The premise went that, okay, it's like Westerners only like give up ground slowly. So they were like, right, well, obviously they're amazing at RTS, because, spoiler, Korea was just the best in RTS from day one. So, okay, RTS ground seeded. Well, that's all right, though, because in the MOBA games like Dota, you know, all the Westerners, and that's Chinese, oh, shit, yeah, they're the best at like the MOBA. Fuck, right. Well, I tell you what, FPS, they can't aim with crosshairs though, can they? Yeah, just all those spells and MOBAs. Yeah, you know what, Koreans, leave the fucking FPS to us. That's us, you know, the Americans. Like, and the joke is like, well, how would you describe it, Gio? And in Overwatch, how good were Koreans?
So it's funny, because with Overwatch really being like my first esport, but also my first exposure to esports, really, like I came into an environment where Koreans were worshipped. They were the majority. They were, I think, obviously there are a few NA teams who very early on were like, you know, really good. Like we've mentioned Envy before as an example of that. But, you know, having like these teams like GC Busan or like Kongdu Panthera or like Lunatic High, as you mentioned, you know, whatever, like are names that people were still talking about like quite a bit later as really sowing the seed. And what was it? It was in the second year of the Overwatch League where a lot of people were saying like over half of the players in the entire league were Korean. And that was I don't know if controversy is the word, but there were... Right. There were some people who didn't give a shit, and there were some people who were not happy about it because they were like, this is crazy. Like, all of these teams going to lose, you know, spots for the Westerners. And it's like, okay, well, play better. But it's kind of a strange one, because for me, like coming into an esport where like a first person shooter esport where Korea was by far and away indisputably the dominant region, it was actually weirder for me to then step into other esports where that wasn't the case. So actually, like something I really took a lot of interest in when I went into Rainbow Six was the Korean region, because I was like, I've just come from an esport where Koreans are so much better than everyone else on average, and it is a tiny little region in Rainbow Six, and I want to see how that development can go. And actually, funnily enough, one of the best teams in the world right now is a Korean team. Like, that development has happened in Rainbow Six. But it was, I feel like I've almost had like that backwards experience there, because I didn't really have like the context of all of these other esports and stuff. I wasn't interested in MOBAs or RTS games. Like, I only cared about FPS games, and that just happened to be the one that I stepped into. So I got like sort of red pilled a little bit, I guess, when I started like, you know, getting involved in other esports.
Because if people don't know, when Overwatch began, me and Monty tried telling everyone, like, Koreans are going to be the best. It's just, it's when, not if, right? And they all just kept telling us, like, it's a different game, even though I come from bloody CSGO. And as I took, like, in fact, here's a bit of insight, because obviously it's a similar game. The reason I know Koreans will be amazing in these games is because even in the games they're not into as a culture, they, as I say, will have one or two teams who just inexplicably are way better than they should be. So you can actually go back, there's a really mad example, no one knows, because it's just so old school, I don't bring it up. In Quake, think about that, the most Western esport of all time, by the way. It's what started esports in the West, was Quake. 1v1 Quake dueling, right, is one of the hardest games ever, not just because of how, like, it's skill dependent the game is, but crucially, the tactics of it are heavily around who you practice with, because essentially, if you don't ever play with certain players, like, their approach to the game and how they control the maps is, like, totally different, right? So what's crazy is, in one of the first giant Quake 3 tournaments, that was like a world championship in 2000, a random Korean guy no one had ever heard of rocked up to this event, finished third in the event, ahead of, by the way, like, people who in past versions of Quake were like champions before this version of Quake came out, then just fucked off back to Korea and was essentially never heard of ever again. And everyone, I remember, even was just going like, who even is this guy? Who was he practicing with? And, like, what's mad is all you need to know is, right back, even back then, Achilios, even though he was a Korean guy that no one heard of, he had a manager. That's all you need to know about Korean esports. Like, this is essentially what they don't get is, you know, in the West, when everyone complains, like, in League of Legends is a very common complaint, like, well, we can't be the best because we don't practice the best. Koreans don't think like that. Even if they know they actually don't have the best practice environment, they will diligently practice as if they were in the best practice environment. Like in CS, in Counter-Strike, if people don't know, the version before CSGO, these players I was just referring to, Solo, Glow, Termi, Perry, when they were playing, they used to be in a scene that had one other team that was vaguely international level, and they didn't even practice them because they had a rivalry with them. What these teams were doing, this is not a joke, is they would just dry run stuff in an empty server. You have to realise, in the West, you sometimes do that if you're like the in-game leader and you just want to test something out, right? They would, as a total team, go into an empty server and dry run all the flashes and the timings of turning away and do it. And all they worked on basically was they knew we don't have the practice, so why not just work on execution? And the mad thing is, it's almost like that fucking scene in the movie Old Boy, you know, where he's like, does it actually work to watch violence? And then would it work? It's like, it worked. It actually worked in real life, though, when you practiced all this shit, like, to get the timings down perfectly. They would do it against the Western teams, and it would work. And so, believe it or not, the one edge they had was they actually took their tactical, like, execution to the level of the best European teams. And so these teams could go in, like, the mid-2000s, and they could, like, have a run where they'd finish second at, like, a major tournament and stuff like this. Was possible. So if you know that can happen in games that Korea doesn't care about, that's why in games like League of Legends or fucking Overwatch, the Koreans just dominate. Because there's one other factor, I want to ask you about this actually, Achilles. You can explain it better than me. You live in Korea. I always say it like this, right? It's not as simple as just look at the PC bank stat. It's also about sort of like, essentially, Koreans have quite a homogenous culture. Like, everyone sort of gets into the same music, the same fucking variety shows they watch every night, same celebrities, the same gossip, but as a result, the same games. Like, what they do is they seem to pick a couple of games and everyone fucking plays that game. And then if you're, like, in the fourth best game, like, the drop-off's like that, isn't it? Like, it's just, it's like the difference between everyone caring about League and a game like Valorant coming along. How would you compare the two?
I mean, I think it's been a little bit of a slow start here with Valorant. I mean, that's a combination of a couple different things. There was the Vanguard system that came out, and that was really fucked.
The anti-cheat thing must have been a problem, yeah.
Yeah, the anti-cheat was really, really an issue, because in order to get it to work, like, you basically, PC bongs were having to set aside, like, sections of the PC bong that are like, well, those are the Vanguard PCs. We have it running. It's working. And now Valorant can be played on it. But, like, if somebody restarts the PC, like, everything could get...
Wasn't the logic something like it was sort of like, it was too intensive as an anti-cheat, basically? So I think you even maybe had to, like, run it as admin or something weird, right? Something like that. And yeah, so if people don't know, in those PC cafes, this is the other thing that how it works in Korea. You don't go to the PC cafe and go, hey, have you heard about that game? Let's download it now. You go and whatever's on the PC, it's almost like Netflix. You just go and you see what's available and you go, oh, let's play this game here. So you either play League, because everyone says let's play League or StarCraft, or you look what's on the PC. So if what's on the PC is like Street Fighter, fucking FIFA, you just play or Crossfire instead of CSGO, you play Crossfire. Like, that's, like, essentially, if you're not on these PC ban cafes, you're in trouble, right?
Yeah. So there was the issue with that, but then also, obviously, like, the game came out during COVID, and eventually what happened was PC bongs and everything in the country was like, okay, well, now we start closing at 9 p.m.
Oh,
That's
right,
not PC Bong hours. Yes. That is not PC Bong hours. PC Bong hours are when, the kids have they go to their school, then they go home, then they go to their after school, their hagwon. They study there, and then they're like, okay, now I can go to the PC Bong, and then they'll play until whatever time in the morning, and then they'll go to bed, they'll wake up, they do it all over again. So the PC Bong numbers are very much not that trustworthy these days. But also, I think that that early harm with Vanguard and the timing of it all during COVID, like, really hurt what could have been an initial spurt of growth for the game. Because Koreans do like to play a lot of FPS. PUBG is still in the top 10. Yes. People play Crossfire. There's like Black Squad. There's Sudden Attack. Point blank.
If you ever look at the raw numbers for those like CS clones, it's crazy how big they are. Like, it's just they're not esports is the problem. They're sort of like more casual games. Yeah, that's the problem.
I think most people don't realize that like Crossfire is like the number one most played game in the world.
Yes, and it's loads of Chinese people I think play it as well, right?
It's Korean made, and it's just like this enormous game. So like Koreans do like to play, but I think that what we're seeing now is actually a lot more people playing from home, because I think a lot of families and people said like, okay, I can't go out to the PC Bong. Like, we need to have a home PC, whether that's for kids to study, and then they also utilize that to play games, etc., whatever. I think that we are seeing have been seeing a large increase of at-home play compared to where prior, when PC Bongs were just 24/7, you could very easily rely on the numbers to tell you everything that you need to know about, what the current power rankings are. I think they still hold a lot of power, but it doesn't tell the full truth anymore like it once did. But yeah, I think that right now we're kind of at this point where in order to really see a spurt of growth for the game to continue to surge forward, I think that we basically just need to win something. I think that if DRX goes and wins Masters, I think we'll see an immediate jump in both the viewership and the player numbers, because Koreans, like, they love when Korea does well at something. You watch the Olympics, whenever there's a Korean on the Olympics, like, every TV is turned to the Olympics. Everybody's paying attention to that. And then as soon as like that person's done competing, they're like, okay, well, we'll just go back to drinking or eating or whatever. We don't have to pay attention to the Olympics until the next Korean comes up. If DRX and Korea can start really competing and winning tournaments on a global level, I think that more people are going to be like, oh, I need this.
Oh, wait a second. Something's happening to your mic there. For some reason, that last sentence you said, it started cutting some words out. Is the mic cable pulled or something? Say the last sentence again. I can't remember. It was after you said something about like winning the regional term. Yeah. It cut like on the word that we were trying to hear though. So it's like, what was the word? So say that last bit again if you can.
So basically, I was just saying that Koreans really love when they see Koreans winning. So I think that if they can take an international event, everybody will be like, holy shit, like, we're really good at this game now. And they'll want to pay attention to it, and they'll want to play it themselves. And I think that will very much instill a large amount of growth into the Valorant scene here in Korea. That, plus now that we have, live audiences and whatnot going on, I think that's also going to very much help.
Yeah, along those lines, by the way, I'll tell a quick anecdote. I was actually telling them this before it started, but if people don't know, what really showed me how wild this approach to following Korean athletes is was actually when in soccer, in European football, there were some players from Korea that actually were able to go to the Premier League, and one of them played for Man United. And if people don't know, I once went and watched a game in a bar where it was with Korean commentary, but it was of the Man United Premier League game. And essentially the joke is, because I don't know Korean, obviously all I'm hearing is when they say the name of the player that I know is Korean. And the joke is, I remember asking like Monty or something like, why did they say his name like 5 times a sentence? And they told me basically the casting over there would essentially be like I'll have to make a random name up because I can't remember this guy's name, but let's say his name was like Seongmin. They were like, Seongmin gets the ball, he passes it up, Seongmin runs around the defender, will he receive it back? He gets it back, Seongmin passes it, and the header comes from the player who received the ball from Seongmin, and he scored, and Seongmin with the pass. And it's like, essentially, because they know that you only care about that one player, they find a way to like just crowbar that player into every sentence. It's like they made it sound like he was like the linchpin of every single thing that happened in the fucking game. And so essentially though, you realise I agree with Achilios. Essentially, like low-key, they just follow success. They're like Americans in that way to some degree. Like Americans will do the same thing. If they have a sport they don't care about, but they get a world champion in it, everyone suddenly gives all the fucks about that game until all of a sudden they're not that good again. And then, like for example, that's why no one gives a fuck about tennis anymore, isn't it? Because there's no top American player now. Magically, they don't care now that all European Koreans dominate. So anyway, the other thing to say is this. There's actually one other detail, but obviously Achilios has to be careful about his opinion about this particular topic. Or does he? Who knows? Just put that out there. The other thing that would actually, by the way, tomorrow help Valorant, but obviously careful how you feel about this, is if Overwatch doesn't keep doing very well, that would absolutely, I'm not joking, tomorrow make like loads of players start playing Valorant fight against Achilios. Because if people don't know about Korean players, when they start playing as pros, it's really hard to get them to stop. As in, if people don't know, there are people to this day playing in StarCraft in like obscure orgs in like fucking like Europe and like China and stuff. They play to this day because they're set on that path. Just the fact the game got smaller doesn't stop them. They're diligent people. They try to work and be number one. That's their mentality. So I think if Overwatch like dies off a bit, or maybe if it was even harder getting the visas or something, I think you'll see a whole bunch more come over, because there's not many at the moment. Actually, there's only a couple from Overwatch in the league right now, right?
I mean, at least in Korea, yeah, the main two are going to be Zoomba and Bazzi. And that was going to bring me to a point is like, not only do you have people who, obviously there are people who are fans of Overwatch and, maybe wouldn't otherwise watch Valorant, but those people are also typically fans of a player in, an individual player. There's so many fans here who just will, rather than support like an entire team, you might just kind of focus in on this one player and be like, that's the person who I support. It's sort of like being like a Tom Brady fan. No matter where Tom Brady ends up, you're going to be like, okay, well, I'll cheer for that team because he's the best quarterback in the world. So it could be like that. And we've already seen a lot of fans come over from the Overwatch scene that have just been paying attention to Bazzi from when he was, playing on 7 in Contender 2018. Then he moved on to the Spark. Then he comes over to here. Same with Zimba, who is an Apex, player from back in the day out here. He's been playing Overwatch competitively for years and years. Was one of the top tank players out there, and then now he's shifted over. And there are people who just watch Valorant because they are fans of those players. If Overwatch were to die, and suddenly you have this massive influx of all of these players who are currently in Overwatch, and they say like, well, I need another game to play. I really like FPS. Valorant's the up and coming thing. And they join in. All of that fandom is going to carry over because the fans do genuinely care about those players as individuals. So that would also be a massive influx. Obviously, I don't wish the death of any game.
Of course.
So that's totally fine. But if nature runs its course, then that's what will happen, I suppose.
Yes.
We just have to wait and see.
Yeah, if people don't know, by the way, that is also a very interesting detail about Korean fans, is even though obviously there are lots of men that follow the game and are fans as well, the fans that you might have seen if you've ever watched a broadcast that are the ones cheering and at the front of the crowd and giving the gifts, they're actually usually like teenage girls.
Always
and
women.
the way they tend to actually
hiding behind
support
their signs.
The way they tend to support the players, though, is like Achilles says, it's more about the personality. Like they already have the concept. It's called idol culture from the K-pop stars. They sort of support players like that. Like the idea is the person's more a fan of, I don't know, Faker's story in League of Legends or his personality, more than like just like, wow, I really love like hardcore LeBlanc player or whatever. Like they're not usually as hardcore in that sense. So I imagine those people would be perfectly logical in swap game if their favourite player moves over and he's still a pro. You can still watch him. In this case, you can even go to the old bloody OGN park. Like it's all working points. It's all going to work. It could all work out. By the way, Gio, if you have any questions at any point, just jump in. I'll let you direct where you want to go on this.
So one thing that I am actually curious about, just given the fact that obviously you yourself are American and have worked in America, and that you are very well acquainted with the Korean scene, a really big discussion that I see mostly between like EU versus NA, but I think it's relevant here as well, is like, how is the culture different, like the mindset culture different that makes like this region perform better than this region? And I've seen it a lot with people saying like, oh, well, like NA, it's just like they just care about the wrong things and they don't like want to practice, and like EU is so much more disciplined, blah, 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 blah. Obviously, we're talking about this in the context of like games where Koreans seem to have this like really unique way of like approaching their practice and yes. And like we said, like even in a game where maybe they're not the dominant region, there are still going to be certain teams that appear to be dominant teams as individuals. Like, how have you like experienced or perceived the difference in like the culture, quote unquote, between the players of each region be?
I mean, right now there's the running gag of, Sentinels never practice and whatnot. And, not to even remotely say that that's correct.
It's a good caricature, though, for what people think of the region. Yeah.
I would say, like, no matter what, like, Korea does practice more than just about anybody who's out there, especially DRX, OnSlayers, the teams that are at the top, they are consistently grinding. And there's always been since you go back to the times of the LCK versus like the LCS and whatnot. People will cry out and be like, well, it's ridiculous how much the LCK practices. Like, that's unhealthy. Yes. They grind too much. It's totally unreasonable that they do that. And we can't expect, North American players or EU players to do the same thing. It's like, okay, that's totally fine. And I get it. And to a degree, you're probably right. They probably are playing too much. But at the same point, you also should never expect that NA or EU will ever win a championship ever. Because if they don't want to put in similar hours and have a similar growth from practice, and like they will never be able to conquer these teams. They'll never be able to beat China and Korea because they are going to put their all into winning. That's what is important to them. That's what they care about. So if you're not willing to try to even come close to matching, then you're going to have a really rough time. In Valorant, like we said, it's kind of just a matter of time as this region becomes more and more competitive and catches up internationally. That same problem very well could come to fruition. If suddenly there are 5-6 great teams here in Korea and they're all practicing against each other, they're all putting in similar hours, NA and EU may very well have struggles when it comes down to squaring off against them. I think we're still a little ways out, obviously, from that happening. We still need to see Korea be a dominant force, win a tournament. But that can absolutely be an inevitability if people start resting on their laurels and thinking like, well, we practice in the best region right now. That just because that's the case, it doesn't mean that it's going to be, down the line. I remember one of the things that really frustrated me back during like contenders at the start of the Overwatch League was the idea of there being a map pool. I think that's still something that frustrates me now, in the Overwatch League, because they've announced that there's going to be one for the new season and whatnot. And it's, I don't know, people always complain like there's so many maps to try to practice and so many game modes. And I'm like, well, all these fucking Korean teams are doing it. It's definitely possible that you could put in the hours to learn these and have strategies and be up to date on what the meta is map over map. Like, teams were doing it throughout all of Apex. Teams were doing it in contenders at the start when we didn't have a map pool. It was just open. And I think it makes it so much more interesting when you are going into a series and you have that map draft. So, like, being able to have that openness and have to put in the work to be good or at least adequate on every single map of the game, I think should kind of be a standard. But, it's just to jump in, like, it's interesting you say, I think I mentioned this on last week's episode, but in Rainbow Six, they've just increased the map pool from 7 maps to 9 maps. The competitive map pool, that is. And that was something that actually a lot of pros wanted. And I was in favor of it as well. But one of the really interesting things I think about having a map pool and what that can do in terms of like being able to judge which teams are really good and which teams are not going to perform so well at international events notably is you end up with teams that are like good best of one I know best of ones aren't really in Valorant, but like good best of 1 teams or good best of 3 teams or good best of 5 teams, right? Because you'll get your teams that like have 3 or 4 maps where they really have, but then they've got some glaring weaknesses on other maps. So on like the smaller series, like they can actually perform really well. So often those are teams that are like amazing domestically. And then as soon as you get into like international competition where you're playing in these bigger playoff brackets with like bigger series, like actually that's where you start to see those weaknesses. And like, in my opinion, I think that is almost arguably an important part of being able to judge competition because like you shouldn't be able to just hide that and it not be a contributing factor to your performance.
Yes, it's one of the reasons why in CSGO people will always complain about best of 1 because with the way the veto system works, which as far as I can tell is the same as Valorant, in a BO1 you can veto 2 maps before you play your map instead of 1 in the series. So obviously the premise goes, if you're really bad on 2 maps in a full series, I can just pick your map that you're bad on, whereas in a BO1, if you only have 2 maps you're bad at, you can just skip those and we get to meet in the middle of the map pool.
That's how it is.
And yeah, exactly. I might be better than you on that map, but overall am I better? No, but the format has to be the one that shows that. On that topic, by the way, because that will always be an eternal topic, how much Koreans practice. All I can tell you in this is, to this day, that argument still goes on in League of Legends. But the reason why it's so funny is because it's like Western people have completely wrecked themselves, because initially Western people just tried, like in StarCraft 2, to be like Koreans and make themselves practice that many hours, right? Then what they did, though, is they found the perfect excuse ever. It's called mental health. Because what you do is you just say it would burn a person out. By the way, they're correct. It will. Like, unless you're some really like alien person like Faker, and even then, as far as I can tell, he might have been burned out a year or 2. It will burn you out like a motherfucker if you play all day long for like 5 years. But what they don't get is this. Does it work? At the end, isn't the guy who does that the one who also wins? The answer is yes. And that's what, at the moment, the West cannot process. Because what they're doing is this. They're essentially saying, I'm willing to be the best and compete the most, but only within certain contexts that I feel comfortable within. Now, that's fine. Do that if you want. But don't complain then if the other guy plays twice as much and then he is better. Like, because essentially what he's doing there is, I'll give the analogy, that's like in sports. Like in sports, they tell you all the stories as though everyone's like Kobe Bryant and fucking Peyton Manning and stuff where they just play. So they're not. They're actually the rare cases. And guess what? What they get is they get more championships, but they give up like a social life. They give up maybe even like mental health and stuff. I'm sure they're going through nightmare periods when they're in a slump and they're practicing all day long. So essentially the joke is in the West, they're still trying to figure out like, they're trying to do that thing like, no, it's better to work smart than hard though. It's like, yeah, but what does work smart mean? No one's figured out like the perfect efficient practice. So at the moment, even if you might not think it's efficient the way the Koreans do it, that scale of practice just does work. And spoiler, everyone is doing it in Korea. There's the difference. In Korea, it's like everyone is Peyton Manning. Or except the joke is when they're not even actually the best. Like, because I used to say to people, you can't get out of that mentality if you're Korean, because it goes like this. Say you won the tournament, like you actually are fake it in T1, you just won Worlds. You think, right, good news, I'm going to get a holiday. No, we've got to stay on top. We're number one now. Like, if we stop practicing, KT takes over. So you have to keep playing. What about KT that lost to you in the final? Well, they're second, so they've got to practice to try and overtake you. What about the last place team? Well, they're never going to get number one unless they practice all the time. The joke is no one's ever allowed a bully break. I even said, even if you win everything like Faker, the premise is like the break for real, like the real, it'll be like you get a week. It'll be like, go away for a week. And by the way, if you really are like Faker and these Korean pros, you'll even bloody play solo queue in the week off.
Be streaming.
Like, yeah, you can't stop these guys. That's why, to me, the difference really goes down to this. The Westerner is being told to practice, and he's going, well, I shouldn't for these reasons. The Korean guy's just doing it. He's worrying about it after the fact. He's not. That's the difference. So to me, that mentality, I agree with you. Essentially, if the game can scale enough, if it's not just going to be like CSGO, where it's a tiny little group of like, 100 people trying to be pro Achilios. If we get like Overwatch, where loads of people go in on it, and forget even League, just Overwatch is good enough. I agree. Eventually, there will be a massive Korean pros and teams in the top end of the scene. As I alluded to earlier, I actually expect, we can talk about this now if you want. I'll tie it into the Geo point. When Overwatch League Season 1 began, there was like whole Korean teams, there was some mixed teams of Koreans and Westerners, and then there was a couple of holdout all Western teams like NRG and NV and Outlaws and stuff. And the idea was they were the absolute best Western players who were able to sort of hold on a bit longer, and even then it got dodgier as I see. But eventually, even by season 2, there was like twice as many Koreans. And by the way, if you look at the later seasons, it's like every team's just Korean. There's like at the end, it's like you have 2 people that could be on like Gladiators or something like that. Like it got ridiculous by the end, but understandable because they were the best. So that's what I'm still waiting for, dude. I know part of it must have been the pandemic and online and not meeting the regions very much. Obviously, you only meet like 2 or 3 times at the moment with the VCT system. But I think inevitably, when you move towards what I've heard is coming down the pipeline, an LCS type system, it's going to be like fucking Sire player. Like I think Sabiel B early on was trying to like play a bit of Valorant. The best Koreans will just be in like Cloud9. They'll just be on the Western Orgs, in my opinion. And I do think the game will get overrun, but it'll be good for the game. By the way, if you just like the game, it's going to make the game way better. It's going to be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it could very well end up being that. We've already kind of seen that shift. I mean, not predominantly, it's not like Overwatch League levels.
Yeah, sure.
With like Japanese VCT, but there is a lot of exporting done over to VCT. So Jett and Lacy, both from Torin, who went and played at Masters. They're currently playing in Japan.
Right.
Obviously, Bazzi came back, but like you saw Munchkin over there and whatnot. Like there's still a good amount of Koreans that are saying like, okay, I'll go play in this region. And they're doing that obviously because there's a higher viewership. So there's more paychecks right now, which is why I'm hoping and praying the game continues to grow so that we can retain these players and not lose the best ones, because if we continue to bleed off players, and the region is never really going to have the opportunity to necessarily become like this powerhouse, or it will at least elongate the process for that to occur. But yeah, I mean, there are already teams out there that are saying like, oh, yep, we need to get Koreans because Koreans are great. Their work ethic is fantastic. These guys are really good. We're going to hire them and give them lots of money. So we're already seeing it occur. I think Zeta, Saya, they're definitely the 2 just kind of like golden examples of what a Korean can achieve in this game, on a foreign team and whatnot. They're doing fantastically. Also does wonders for especially Saya, who has lived in North America for a very, very long time.
Yes.
I haven't spoken to him in a while, but I imagine that his English at this point is probably very good.
It's going to be decent at least, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because he's there since season 1 on Florida Mayhem.
Yeah, he also was on a Western team, not just like a Korean team. Exactly, yes.
Yeah, he was on a team with a bunch of Europeans, so he really had to understand English to a
He had bloody Finnish players, mate. I bet he has an amazing... but his ear's incredible for it. Fucking hell. Like, I can barely understand them when they start going in English sometimes. Fucking hell. If people don't know from Formula 1, they're the famous accent. Like, what are you doing? Like, it's like the fucking robot, mate. It's mental. So, God bless them that they had to learn English, play with people like that. By the way, I want to ask, since you referenced him, the most famous player, obviously, in the Korean scene from Overwatch is, of course, Zoomba, who was on the legendary Lunatic High Soul Dynasty, and as you say, it was basically one of the best off tanks in the world at one point in time on the Zarya, the Diva. How good is he actually in Valorant? Like, I notice he plays controller basically.
He's so fucking good. Again, I think a lot of people are going to look at this final and be like, "Oh man, they're really losing it." But it was definitely a bit of an off day. If you look at all of their series leading up throughout the season, barring the losses that they did suffer, he is so on point. Even last year when Astra came out, Zoomba was, I think, the clear number 1 Astra player in the world when she first started getting picked up by pros. He was the person who just had the utmost knowledge about how to play her, how to work her timings, and how to really maximize lurking. He was the one who kind of like came up with the gravity well, to like the counter gravity well rather. So if you're going to get gravity weld off a spike diffuse, you gravity well yourself on the spike so that it counteracts it. He's kind of the one who invented that to at least to my knowledge, or at least did it with the most success, so the most reliability. Yeah. So he was really, really ingenuitive. Even in this last final, despite the fact that they lost, if you look at that first map of Haven, there's this fantastic moment where he just throws 3 stars to try to retake a site, and they call it caterpilling, when you just line them all up. And he goes charging through the smokes on the A site to try to retake it. And it doesn't end up working out. But the fact that he's able to do that in just, at the drop of a hat, he reacts that quickly. He decides that this is the play that needs to be made. It was the best play that he could have made in that moment. He's so in tune with that pick. So for a while, I would say he was absolutely the best Astra. Now we're shifting over towards, Omen. He'll still pick up Viper and whatnot. And he's still quite good. His game sense is still very much on point. He knows when somebody's going to come wrapping around a corner, and he just knows the perfect position to put himself in to lurk and catch them off guard. He knows when to dissipate his star so he can catch somebody who thinks that they're creeping up through a smoke. Suddenly a smoke's gone and they're caught with their pants down, and he just shoots them. His game sense is incredible. So I'd say that Zoomba, he hasn't missed a single day of practice when it comes down to FPS gaming. The man is still on point, and I love seeing that this guy who was playing in Apex was, regaled as being one of the best off tanks out there, is now finding success in this other game.
Oh, it's cool.
I just hope that this could be a dominant year for him, because the one problem when it comes down to following Korean pros is the ticking time bomb of military service.
Yes.
And Zoomba will.
Is he getting up there in age?
Yeah, we're getting to that point where it's going to be a bit of an inevitability. I don't know.
He's 24
after this or not. So.
Yeah,
but. Yeah, he's
24. So basically,
can find something.
Basically, he's at the period where you can still technically defer a few years, but usually you only do that if you are a top pro. So essentially, what Achilios is saying is, if he doesn't if he doesn't think there's a career, he might just go now and do the military service and try and come back in 2 years. Basically, I think it's now down to a year, though, isn't it? Didn't they put the amount of service down?
About a year and a half.
Yeah. But the problem is you won't be able to play games. You can actually still go to a PC bag and play a game, but you wouldn't be able to be a pro. You have to go off to a barracks and do a fucking job and get all the jazz, You won't be in a war, but you will have your time taken.
How cushy of a job you get, because
you can sometimes get an office gig, right?
Yeah, you can do military service, you could do firefighting, you could also do just police work, but that can put you anywhere in the country, because they'll be okay, well, we have a fire station that needs a firefighter. You're going to go down to this city, in the middle of nowhere at the center of the country, and train and whatnot, and then you're there for a year and a half.
It also goes without saying, all of the esports is in Seoul. You have to be in Seoul, basically. It's the equivalent to Hollywood. You have to just be there, otherwise you're not part of the scene.
Yeah, pretty much. So if you can't be in Seoul, then it makes it a little bit more difficult. Runner from the owner of Runaway and whatnot, he kind of lucked out. He did have an office job. It was a position where I believe he had his weekends off and whatnot. So
that's cool.
Oftentimes, he was able to come by the studio and be with the players. He just wasn't allowed to be on broadcast. That's the other thing, is if you're doing your service, you're not really supposed to be in a position where you're on a televised broadcast or anything like that. So he couldn't hear with the team while, we were doing contenders and whatnot, but he could be in the back room and talk to them in between games and whatnot. He just couldn't come out on stage and do it.
I actually have a question about Zoomba because, you mentioned how the grand finals was not on Slayer's like best performance. I watched the highlights of it. I didn't actually see the full thing. It was 3-0 to DRX, but he played Astra on every single one of those maps. Do you think that, like, I'm really interested in the fact that he's still playing Astra even in 4.04. First of all, did Korea only go to 4.04 for playoffs, or were they on 4.04 for a couple of weeks before then, like NA?
It was just for the playoffs.
Okay. So this was like basically the first time that they started doing that. Do you think that was a contributing factor to why it was, like, the fact that, if I look at like what DRX were playing and they've they're bringing like Omen instead of Astra on like Haven, for example, is that like something that came into that? Do you think they need to like let go?
I think it definitely could have been a contributing factor, and it's obviously something that we won't have unless I could talk to him, but it's not something that we'll necessarily have the answer to until we get to stage 2. If we get to stage 2 and Zumba's still playing Astra, we'll know, like, okay, no, he just thinks that this is better.
Right.
And at times I do agree with him. I think that there are certain maps in particular where she can still find incredible impact and can really bait people. Like I'd say Haven, Ascent are probably the two ones at the forefront of my brain.
Pick,
yeah, I'd say that either of those maps you can definitely get away with it. Ascent more so. But again, I think it's also kind of one of those things where it's like, well, you're just so good at playing this that it's not, even with the nerfs, it's not even necessarily that much of a detriment. And he has shown that in the series leading up to that grand final and whatnot, after they did get knocked to the lower bracket versus DRX, like all of the other series that they did play, he was still playing the Astra and he looked phenomenal on it. So it very much seemed to be the case where it's like, well, even though the character's gotten nerfed, you haven't really been nerfed because you are just so above and beyond, just good at playing it. Whether or not that mentality is going to hold moving forward, I don't know. But I would never say that any of the picks from that series and that grand final were contributing factors really to why OnSlayers lost. It was very much just how it was played. Everybody was looking really great, really on point in that first map. And then I think as soon as they lost it in overtime, they just kind of knew, like, well, shit, from here, we might be screwed. Because Fracture's the second map. They lost a 16-18 overtime to WGS on that map. So they do not like to play on Fracture. And, Haven was kind of like one of their best bets, a map win. And I think that once they lost that, they just kind of were mentally shook up and they weren't able to recover from it. So, but yeah, I think that I won't be surprised at all if we go into stage 2, unless there's even more tuning that happens and maybe Astra gets nerfed again. But I will not be shocked if we still see Zumba playing it then.
By the way, I also do think that's cool as fucking games that have like character diversity. Like, it's not like Quake or Counter-Strike where it's like you're the same character, it's just the player that's different. I always love that when things aren't in the meta, but people are just so absurdly good at the specific kit of that like character that they can just make it work anyway. And sometimes they're even better than what's in meta. Like, there's classic examples in League, stuff like Thresh, Lee Sin, if people don't know. These champions don't even have to be in the meta. If you're just a god of these, you play them whenever it's possible because you can just do shit people can't.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you'd get, like, people playing Blitzcrank and whatnot when Blitzcrank was so far out of the meta.
Oh, for sure.
Like, if you get those hooks and if you are reliable at nailing your kit, then you find so much impact, just as if so many people weren't really at that point. But then you get people like, Bada and whatnot, or like Mad Life, they'll just be like, oh yeah, fuck it. Like, I'm just going to play Blitzcrank here, even though like we haven't seen one in 4 months. And then they crush with it. So you can get that individual, like identity with players where you kind of think of them being like, this is the agent that they play, and like that's just kind of like the de facto thing. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's cool as well.
Legit, bad chest.
I think it's just like, obviously at this point in like post patch, when there are players who are still playing, like, let's say, like pre-patch agents, we're at a point where you don't quite know if it's because they're going to like really stick to that agent yet, or if it's because like actually they don't feel comfortable like switching yet. So yeah, I agree with you that like there needs to be a little bit more time to see like which reason it is, and if he sticks to it in stage 2, then obviously it's just because he's like, yeah, fuck you, I'm like the best Astra. But like it's still trying to like figure out how that is, because I think it's always inevitable that there are going to be teams that don't immediately make the switch.
Yes.
I think I mentioned it before, but like, yeah, I remember when Astra kind of first came in, like back on in EU last year, like there were a bunch of teams that still insisted on playing Omen for quite some time after that patch, even though on paper Astra was kind of the better agent. And after a while, obviously, like a number of those teams, you know, switched over to Astra. It sort of became kind of non-negotiable that she was always going to perform better. But yeah, like it's never going to be every team is going to immediately make that switch or immediately have things planned or immediately feel more comfortable. So it's just kind of figuring out if it's like a characteristic thing just because this player is particularly good at it, or just like what I just said.
Along those lines, actually, Achilles, I have a question like that, because then if you want to draw again with broad strokes about like stereotypes of how Koreans approach esports games, right? One of the classic ones is like, if you know in League of Legends, for example, they're actually not the region, even when they were the best, that always generated all the new picks. In fact, actually Europe famously, because people tend to be a bit more individualistic, they used to sometimes come up with the pick and then say if the Koreans thought was good, they would like perfect it. So I know in Korea, for example, their mentality is a lot more based around results. So for example, I've heard, because if people don't know, Yamato Cannon, a Western coach, actually did briefly get to coach. It was actually the Sandbox team in LCK. He actually got to coach a Korean team. And basically the problem he said was this, is if you came with a pick that was really good, like you've seen in the meta, this looks like it'll be really good. If you came to your player, he would just sort of say, well, why would I play it though? Because X, Y, and Z, and he would just list off the best players at his role. They don't play it. Well, the problem with that logic is obviously like that doesn't make any sense, because by that logic, you're never ever going to get a new champion in the pool. But the premise they had was they essentially only wanted to waste their time practicing what worked. So the way that you get new diversity in the Korean scene actually is usually based on things like a one trick on the server is just incredibly good at that one agent in this case. And believe it or not, that will actually make people take notice, because their logic will be, well, he's not as a player as good as me, but he's fucking amazing on this character. So I better pay attention. And if people don't know, even really legendary pros like Faker would like message on the ladder one trick players and ask them stuff like, how are you playing like that character like that? Like, what's the secret to that combo? Or why do you play it in this matchup? And they would essentially just like harvest the info. So the interesting thing is, on the one hand, they seemed like actually they would often stick to what they just thought worked, and they were sort of like a bit resistant to change. But if they think the change is good though, they will actually very quickly adapt. So how are they actually in Valorant in this sense, Achilios? Like, do they pick up a lot of the new stuff quickly? Do people try? Is it the lower teams that experiment? What's it like, would you say?
I think this year is when we're seeing a little bit more willingness to adjust quickly. Like I mentioned, like with DRX last year, they did not want to adjust at all. They kept going back to their old compositions and whatnot, and they were really struggling. We weren't seeing teams picking up Viper and whatnot when she was just, became absolutely busted, because it was, you would walk through a wall and just get decayed down to 1 instantly. It's like, what? Or maybe it was down to 50 instantly. I forget what the exact numbers were there, but even then, like we weren't seeing people really picking up Vipers. So I think this year we're seeing a bit more willingness to adjust. The lower tier wildcard teams are absolutely the ones that are a bit more willing to experiment.
Okay.
From the outset, it was, I think, Desperado versus DRX was the first series that both of the teams had played. Desperado, a team comprised widely of people who are, veterans and were also trainees and streamers on Vision Strikers.
Right.
They came together as 5. They managed to qualify. And you have Secret, formerly of Damwon Kia, in the first map of Breeze, is like, all right, I'm going to play Neon. It's the first time that we've ever seen it in the region. Like, I'm going to bust it out. And he absolutely destroyed. They lost the game 13-2. But he posted over 400 ACS and had like 25 kills or something across those 15 rounds because he played Neon.
Respect.
It was the highest ACS I've ever seen on a team that gets absolutely dumpstered. But they know, like, we have to try to throw a curveball at DRX, because they are this team that has coaching staff, that has all of this, all of these analysts working behind the scenes and whatnot to build them up. They have the best players in the region. We have to try to throw something different at them to catch them off guard. They tried it with the Neon. The Neon individually worked. The comp did not, because they were running triple duelist. So, you'll see teams that basically feel like we don't have anything to lose. There's no parent company that's going to be upset with us if we end up bombing out of this. We're playing as 5 friends. They will try to do some crazy stuff. So Holy Moly doing it. Their series as well. They managed to take down WGS. They did an entire map of Bind where they rushed nothing but B on the attacking side. They went B out of 8 times out of 12 rounds on the attacking side. They just kept doing the same, not quite the same exact setup, but they always ended up at the B site. Then they go, into the next series, they play Bind again. Instead of rushing B all the time, they run a comp without a duelist, which is only designed to get onto the A site and then completely block it off so the defenders can't retake it.
Okay.
They were coming up with some really cheesy shit. We also saw them play the first and only Yoru that we've had this entire stage, and it ended up getting them a win. So, when you do have those lower tier teams that feel like they have a lot more room to kind of just mess around with things, and they know, if we lose, it's kind of whatever. We already exceeded our own expectations. They will kind of push the boundaries. And when things do work, teams might look at that and say, hey, this was actually a really intriguing idea. Let's take the resources that we have, because we have 3 analysts and we've got 2 coaches and whatnot. Let's kind of pick apart this composition and see if we can't iterate on it and make it even better. So, you could see somebody taking that duelistless comp from Bind and potentially mastering it and making it into something that could really, hold water on an international stage. We just kind of have to wait and see.
I actually have a question for Gio along those lines then, right? In CSGO, one of the ways that upsets are often sort of fermented, essentially is understood by teams in the scene. There's certain maps, classically in CSGO, it's maps like Dust 2 and Mirage, which are sort of a bit more individualistic maps. They're not as much about raw executes and stuff. And also on these maps, the upsets tend to come if people play a bit more poggy, a bit looser, because what you basically pray for is just make the game a bit random and then hope you have a pop-off. If 1 or 2 players pop off, maybe you can win this map and you get it done, right? Is there something equivalent to that in Valorant? Like if someone knows they're the underdog team, do they run certain comps? Do they try cheeses like this much? Is that a sense? Because I know, for example, one of the premises goes like this. In these sorts of games, the problem can sometimes be if you try to play a very tactical style against the number 1 team, they just essentially are a better version of you, and it just means you have no chance to win. What is it like in Valorant at the moment?
In my opinion, you don't see that to an extreme extent. I mean, there's always going to be teams that will try certain things. So for example, what Achilios just said, where you've got a team who are going to bring triple duelist. And a lot of that is to try and subvert the expectations of your opponent. You can play really aggressively. But the problem is because I think of the role expectations in Valorant with a lot of the agents is if you decide to do something like that, you're going to have to forego another component of your composition that would be incredibly useful for whatever it may be, whether that's site setup, whether that's, holding a site, whether it's initiation, whatever that might be. And so I think to an extent, you still kind of have to have some kind of balance in whatever your Valorant composition is, because there will be a really glaring exploitation in your composition that a good team that you're going against could certainly do something about. But as just discussed, you do see examples of teams kind of bringing out some crazy things or unexpected things to try and throw off the opponent. I mean, when I was doing the Northern Europe playoffs just a couple of weekends ago, we actually saw a Yoru be brought on Bind, and it actually didn't go very well. It was awful. And a lot of that was because it was super easy to read into. They would always play the Yoru on B long, and it was oh, I wonder where Yoru is. Could he be on B long? And no one was falling for the flashes and stuff like that. And so it didn't work. And I mean, the game that we've discussed before, Optic versus version 1, when Optic first brought the Neon on Haven, actually that like really threw off version 1, but they were able to adapt like at some point during the game, and therefore it actually didn't have the effect that they wanted it to. Now Optic did end up improving on that and bringing that into playoffs, and now they've qualified for Masters. So like that's kind of a different way you can look at it, is like building on the failed attempts at bringing something unexpected. But in my personal opinion / experience, I don't think I've seen anything that's like too far one way or the other in terms of trying to like really go crazy, like with, you know, a quintuple duelist or some shit like that, where it's just like, okay, let's throw caution to the wind and get rid of like these other things that we can gain from you know, other agents. You know, you might see like, okay, this team wants to play double controller and this team wants to play double duelist, so they only have one controller and blah blah blah. So you have different strengths in different places, but I personally don't think I've seen anything really crazy, at least not at this level of Valorant. You never know what's going on in the underbelly.
Because I actually think that's a very positive sign, what you're saying there, Achilios, because if people don't know, probably the number one complaint to this day about League of Legends in Korea is that there is an infuriating tendency to play correct League of Legends. And so what you get is matches where number one plays number two, and number one is better, and number one just wins by this margin constantly through the whole game, and number two correctly responds, but with like a player that's going to just gradually lose. And essentially at the end of the game, you just want to turn to like the number two team and go, how are you ever going to win though? Like, you basically just played into their hands. Like, you did everything they thought you'd do, and it was all predictable. Like that's a famous thing that essentially like a lot of them won't sort of like break with their meta and try something crazy because their mentality, remember, is if I'm practicing the most and we're trying to be the best, we'll just be the best, and so the execution will work. But like, I'm very glad in an FPS game at least where you can be explosive, people try some cheese at least.
I remember. This definitely isn't like the last occurrence of this by any means, but it's the one that sticks with me the most, was to bring back up MVP again when they existed back in 2016. I remember that once they had qualified in for the 2016 season, they started things off with a bang. I think their first series that they played was versus like KT Rolster, who everyone thought was going to be, you know, number 2, certainly top 3 in the region. And I think they beat them, because they did some wacky stuff. I can't remember exactly what they did, but I do remember being like, holy shit, MVP is like coming into this. They're not playing the exact meta. They're changing it up. They're throwing some curveballs here. And it worked. Like, they got this. Like, what the fuck is this? And it was really cool to see somebody kind of break away from the standard method of play. Because this is also back in the era of, you know, we do tower swapping. You know, that was the chess game that you play. It's like, okay, push this, and then everybody swaps lanes, rotate up to the top side, top laner goes to the bot lane, and we just do this. And it would be, you know, that first 19 minutes of gameplay, you had like no action. But I remember MVP doing something a bit different. I'm pretty sure they beat KT's, the team that really comes to mind. I'm kind of testing my memory here at this point, but I remember being impressed about that. And when you do see it, it's often fun. Sometimes you see teams do something completely new and it's completely and utterly tragic. It, you know, completely falls flat and you can't even really garner any amount of humor or interest out of it. I do see that happen sometimes with these wild comps that do get tried in Valorant from time to time, where I'm like, I would love to get excited about this, but you're just getting shat on. But when it does at least work to a degree, it does make it very entertaining. That B rush strategy from Holy Moly versus Damwon Kia, they almost beat them. I could tell you the scoreline if I pull up my notebook right now. Like, it was a close series, and it absolutely should not have been. It was 14. Wait, no, that's the first time they played against each other. I don't know. Anyway, it was entertaining as shit. And it was a close match. And I could at least rely on that and be like, okay, this is fun. But when somebody just gets crushed, 13-2, I'm like, I appreciate that you're trying something new, that you're trying to catch them off guard. But this just isn't it. You can't do this all the time. You have to think about it a little bit more.
By the way,
said, like, there's parameters that need to be met in order for a comp to work. And some of these teams, they do not meet them at all.
In light of what you said earlier about like Koreans following players, though, what do Koreans actually think, by the way, about the Koreans that play in the Western teams like Zeta and stuff? What is their perception of these guys?
I imagine overall really, really great. You know, I think that they have high opinions of them. Obviously, Saya Player comes from a very large fan base from his time in both Apex on Meta Athena and then into the Overwatch League. Maybe a little bit less so when he was in Florida Mayhem, at least in those first few seasons. But you know, he's always been held in high regard here, and he is one of the best raw aimers that Korea has ever produced. You'd say, in my opinion, it'd be basically like him and Ons that really come to mind. So I'd say that like the Koreans are very happy to see him finding success. For Zeta, I don't know as much. I can imagine that people are very happy to see a representative from the country be able to go as deep as they did at Champions, to be able to perform as well as he does on that roster, because it's not like he's the worst player on that roster. Like he is consistently, you know, finding immense amounts of impact for that squad. There's not to say that there's a bad player on that roster, so don't freak out, NA fanboys. Don't worry. But if it was, it wouldn't be the fucking Korean. So keep going. But overall, I'd like to think that it is good. The thing that would be the most telling is if we could have him come back to Korea and, you know, play in a tournament here and see how many people would show up. Yeah, that'll be interesting. To show support and, you know, to bring, you know, gifts, whether it's coffees or baked goods and whatnot to him. I would love to see that happen. My dream right now for Valorant out here is to basically recreate Apex. I would love to have 4 Korean teams and then bring in some Westerners off from EU. Yes, I think it'd be absolutely fucking incredible. Just run like a month and a half long tournament, have everybody out here, play against each other, and I think that would be awesome. But that would be a moment for that kind of that return home. If we had the Guard and C9 come out from NA, all the fans show up at the studio to show support for Saya Player, and Zeta, like. That would be the most telling thing. Hey, there's that empty period at the end of the year now, post champs. So maybe. I have been taking this somewhat seriously, and I'm thinking about if I can just running it my fucking self. That would be so and finding sponsors, but obviously that's a whole hell of a lot of work. So we'll see. And by the way, as much as people. Even though people might know Koreans are the ultimate homers, like they do just support Korea super hard. If you're ever in a game, because this happened at the beginning of League of Legends, where the perception, and in Apex, if the perception is though that the best Western team is like as good or it's going to be comparable, they will also be very popular if they go to Korea. Like there'll be loads of fans that it'll be so novel to them to have like an American team there or European team. Like, they would actually be very well received. Like believe it or not, the fans wouldn't cheer against. It's only when they have like a T1, like a dominant, unbeatable team that they'll get a bit mean as fans, you know. Yeah, you'll never get like the library situation where there's like nobody making noise at all in the audience. Like the Koreans are overall very respectful, yes, which is great. But you don't even have to be like good. You know, obviously, if you're going to come here and perform and try to beat Koreans, you have to be good. But I mean, you don't even have to be considered to be on equal footing as them. Just putting in minor amounts of work can go a long way into developing a Korean fan base. Back in Apex, I forget if it was season 1 or 2, but Cruz, when he was playing on Reunited, he came out here and he made an effort. Yeah, he made an effort to learn Korean, and he was commenting on ladder in Korean. He was learning for quite a long time. Respect. Yeah, and he got so many fans. Like you wouldn't have been able to guess, like, is this Ryu Jae Hong's fan line or is this Cruz's fan line? Like they were equally long because everyone's just like, this guy, he cares, he's respectful, like he likes to, he learned Korean, like that's amazing. I've had it as well with myself. Like I'll go out to like a bar or a restaurant or whatever, and like you just order in Korean, and the staff they appreciate the effort, right? Like, they're like, that's so nice of you. Because they'll say like, oh, a lot of other foreigners who come into my bar, they just say like, give me a beer. They don't ask. They say it in English. They don't ask in Korean. They're not respectful. They don't like do. They don't play the culture game. And if you just do that and show just a minute amount of respect, like Koreans will absolutely love you for it. It's really similar with Japan as well, because in Rainbow Six, Fnatic, who are actually an Australian team, for a long time, actually many years now, they've been planning on moving to Japan. And that was meant to happen in 2020, and then obviously COVID kind of screwed things up. But there were a couple players, notably this one player, Mag, who's kind of like their poster child, who really started learning Japanese, tweeting in Japanese, like really interacting with Japanese fans. And so their Japanese
Japanese fan base is disgustingly big. And there was actually a major in Tokoname in Japan towards the end of 2019. It was November 2019. And like they were one of the most popular teams there. Like apparently the Japanese crowd was wild anyway because they just cheer for everyone. But like they were one of the most popular teams that everyone was like talking about just because like they have made such an effort. Even just these specific players have garnered such a huge Japanese fan base just by like taking what is essentially minimal effort, right? To engage with them and not, I think it's about like not assuming that they have to be part of like your culture and actually taking an interest in theirs, right? And you know, like it goes a long way. It's crazy. Like it really doesn't take a ton.
Oh, by the way, since you referenced it earlier, Achilles, I did have one question because I was looking through your tweets to see if you had any interesting conversation starters. And when, as you referenced, there was the upset win of Holy Molly versus Damwon, which was a massive upset. You did tweet, I'm assuming this was a bit tongue-in-cheek, that like Harry is the best fucking fucking Valorant player, right? Obviously, he's not the best, but I want to ask, like, how good actually was this player? Like, what, is he actually a good player on a smaller team? People don't know he's the Chamber Viper Killjoy player.
Yeah, he's another one of them that kind of, you know, had a really unfortunate final series as they did get, you know, knocked out of that lower bracket by Onslayers and whatnot. Leading into that series, honestly, I was heavily considering that Holy Moly might be able to beat Onslayers because that's how wild they were able to play. That's how consistent they were looking. And Harry just was incredible the whole way through. I mean, I don't have it readily available to like forward or anything, but we had, you know, like the playoffs, like stats kind of like tracked. And we had like one of those, you know, like hexagonal graphics or whatever, where it like stretches out into the different positions.
Yeah.
And he was basically, he was maxed out in every regard. Even when the rest of the team was not doing well, Harry was always finding impact. And this is from, you know, when they were just losing series, because they came into the playoffs with like a 2-5 record. You know, they were only able to beat two other teams. And one of them was WGS and the other was Desperado, I believe. So like they didn't put up good numbers, but for whatever reason, they just went full Dark Horse mode, led by Harry just charging in a battle. And he just started crushing people, just incredible clutches the whole way throughout. You know, he was typically finding like first bloods in like 80% of the rounds that they won. Harry was the one who was like opening things up. He just put up some really crazy numbers. And for anytime somebody could do that on a losing team, it's always impressive.
Oh, of course, yeah.
The de facto person that I think of in that same regard is Fleta, who's one of the best DPS that Overwatch
the original solo carry, yes.
Yeah, the one who was able to stand out on Flash
King Farah.
So for anybody to be able to do that in Valorant as well, it's equally as impressive. So for Harry, I think that he's somebody who could absolutely have a very bright future ahead of him if he can get on a team that, you know, has sponsors, has a coaching staff, and, you know, they build out a roster. I think you could keep that 5 if you just put a coaching staff around them with an analyst or two. They absolutely could grind and work to become a top 3 team.
By the way, Gio, in Valorant, how much is that a thing where if someone really is like insane and they just pop off, like how much can someone sort of 1v9 in a game? Because basically people don't know. Games like League of Legends, I would even say Overwatch, you can't really. Like even if you're the best Widowmaker ever, you'll get your kills, but we'll win the game if we have all the best tank and the fucking, like, you know what I mean? Like if we have the better team, we'll win. Days. So can you actually do it in Valorant nowadays?
I think you can have the skill to do it, but I think a lot of, I mean, even like the really insane duelists who have like crazy mechanical skill, a lot of it is about how the rest of their team set them up, right? It's like you can have like a 1v1 between 2 duelists and it's actually decided by whose team set them up the best, right? And stuff like that. So I suppose you can probably get certain situations where you get like a 1v9 situation. It's like, holy shit, this person's insane. But as like a consistent, this is an expectation of this team sort of thing, I don't think that's something that you see a ton, because I don't think you can usually credit stuff like that in Valorant to just one person.
Right.
It's
because if people don't know, the problem obviously in games like League of Legends is it doesn't matter how good you are, because the game makes the opposite team stronger as they get a lead. So essentially, like, it's like they can be twice as strong as you. Whereas obviously in CSGO, if Simple really is the best player, well, he just gets another gun in 2 rounds and then he's just even ground again in it. So if he's better than you, he really can win those fights. So it's not impossible if you are like the absolute best. What are you going to say, Achilios?
I was just going to say, like, the one clear example of a 1v9 that we've had in Korea was last year, and that was Hyunny versus Torin. So Hyunny was playing on, I don't even remember what the hell the team's name was, but he was playing on just some, no-name team or whatever, goes up against Torin and absolutely destroys them. I mean, just basically nobody else finding any kills. He was just coming up with like 4Ks basically every single round, and just utterly destroyed Torin on Bind and then Ascent, I believe. I could try to go back and find it, but it was just one of the nastiest performances that I've ever seen. And then, of course, Hyunny got picked up, and everybody was really excited to see what was going to happen. He was playing for Torin. Oh, he's on DFR. I just found it. And, they went 13-6 on them versus Torin on Bind. He utterly destroyed the lobby. And then Torin picked him up, and he never played Jett again, basically.
Okay. Well, to be fair, they did neutralize him then. They got him and they said, right, no more of that. Lock him in a fucking room, no more.
Yeah.
What the hell?
Try to do what Vision Strikers did to Lakia, as some people would say, which is another annoying storyline.
Free Lakia.
That's also a weird thing about the Korean scene, though, if people don't know. The Korean scene also has a very weird mentality to, like, benching and using subs. Like, they will for real bench, like, star players if they think you just play bad in one game. And then if the sub plays well, suddenly the sub's the starter. Like, that can happen. Or the nightmare thing where there's a really good player and he's just sat on a bench. He never joins a rival bloody team. That's probably the worst, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's kind of what we had with Lakia. He gets picked up by Vision Strikers because he wants to join the team. So many people think that this was very much a malicious effort by Vision Strikers to kind of like neuter Torin and make sure that they could never qualify for anything again. Okay, it wasn't the case at all. Like, they mutually wanted to work together. But everything that I had heard, because of course, like, whenever there's an international event going on, I'm like talking to people and I'm like, hey, like, what's going on? Like, do you think Lakia's going to play? Do you think Lakia's going to play? And everything that I hear is like, he's not been doing well in scrims. It seemed like that the teamwork aspect that was so well built up by Vision Strikers, where everybody is on the same page, everybody has played together for so very long, adding Lakia in there really offset the balance, whether it was as far as the comms are concerned or as far as the flow of a round goes, in the decision making. I can't really say for sure, but it just seems like he wasn't really gelling with the rest of the team, which is why we didn't see him. It had nothing to do with them just trying to be like, well, now he's out of the equation, fuck you, Torin. It was just, they really made an effort to have him be a starter on this team and to be able to make that substitution work. It just never did, unfortunately.
Lakia was an interesting one because he's the most prevalent example that at least I can think of like a team having a specialist, like, to be used for like certain maps or certain things like that. This was something that was actually like really common in Overwatch, and some people have spoken about, like, is this something that we will expect to see in Valorant? And and yeah, that was the thing at like Champs, right? Is like people would be like, oh my god, this has got to be the series where we're going to see Lakia because like they're going to play Bind and therefore blah 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 blah. And then you would see the team walk out and it'd be like, he's not there, like, where is he? Mm-hmm. And as an audience member, like, that was it was kind of a big thing because you felt like this is going to be the game, and everyone had become a really big fan of this guy because, like, he specifically in the instances in which he would get subbed in for, like, was really fucking good, or at least like how we saw him before. And then obviously, as you mentioned, like, saying that he wasn't performing in scrims, or like they had just built up this synergy as a 5 that didn't really include him as much. Like, it makes me wonder if, like, we are ever going to see more examples that are kind of comparable to that, where you do have like a guy who's just there to specifically play on a specific map or a specific agent, a specific role, whatever it is, and if that's actually feasible or if it's just going to end up in the same situation.
So basically, the pine of Valorant, essentially.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely possible, but it really depends on the direction that the game takes, I suppose. Because I think that the most predominant reason that you would want to swap somebody in is going to be for the agent picks.
Yes.
So unless you have somebody who is so damn good at this one agent, let's say it's the next one that comes out, they're so good at it, and like nobody else in the team can play it to that level, and you feel like it's so necessary, it's so meta, at least on certain maps, that you need to have a 6th player for it. I can see that happening, but there is always that concern of just how will things gel together, because I think the most important thing you could have is just clear communication, and a clear, somebody who knows how to IGL with the other 4 people around them. You bring somebody else into the mix, they have different strengths compared to the other player that you're playing with. Suddenly you have to change your decision making as an IGL, because it might be better to do this other thing compared to what you might be doing as a default. I don't know. It's a complicated issue, but I think that it will inevitably happen. Whether or not it's with the next agent or 5 down the line, I don't know. But I feel like eventually we'll get to the point where it's rough to anticipate that everybody who's on your team can play all of the available agents per role to 110%, and you may need to have a little bit more flexibility and leeway in the roster. So I think that it eventually will happen, but we're probably still a ways away from it being done in a very concise and easy manner. I thought Vision Strikers would have been able to pull it off, but the fact that they couldn't, it tells me that we saw a ways to go.
I would suspect.
I was just going to say, it's curious actually, because I was wondering if, I don't know, it's still kind of early to tell, but I was wondering if maybe it would be the other way, because just sort of referencing Overwatch, you had a situation where you had maybe your team would have a specialist Widow and a specialist Tracer, and they would each take the hit scan role, and dependent on who you wanted to play in that map. But then when we got to the GOATS era, and teams were kind of forced into this reconciliation of the fact that actually if your players can't be flexible and can't play multiple heroes, then you're not going to be a very successful team. And I think after that there was sort of this realization that actually flexibility was non-negotiable, and so it just kind of makes me wonder if in Valorant that would be a similar thing, where it's no, we have to be flexible, we have to be able to cover everything. We can't just have one guy who's going to be, let's say this guy's the chamber opper and this guy's the Jett opper, and we switch them out depending on whatever. Your team of 5 has to be able to cover both of those things.
Yeah, for sure. And I will never for a second be try to pretend and say one tricks are okay. I think everybody should be flexible. I think that if you can't play at least 3 or 4 agents at a very high level, then you're going to have a really rough time as far as just longevity of your career goes as a pro. You need to be able to keep up. And as more agents are getting added in, it's only going to get rougher and rougher if they are going to be meta. So yeah, I think 100% you need to have that flexibility, because like you said, if teams didn't have that in their players during the GOATS era, so many teams would have never been able to compete. And that's why you saw the standout squads like Vancouver Titans, like the San Francisco Shock, who had so much depth, who had so much flexibility amongst all their players, being the 2 teams that made it into the grand final. Same thing will happen for Valorant. I'm just curious that if eventually we will hit a point where there's so many agents that somebody needs to try to stay on top of, that it's not going to be that feasible, and that 6th player will become a necessity. I think that just mathematically, yes, it should occur. But it also comes down to just how complex they continue to make new agents. Because if they continue to go up in complexity and they continue to be really ridiculous to play, you look at League of Legends and some of the power creep and the complexity.
Oh, it's got ridiculous. Yeah.
There's some that are just absolutely batshit insane. I don't even fully still know what Achilios does, because it's just too complicated.
Just a really complicated
game. I'm not even going to bother trying to learn that. So if we go into that direction with Valorant, then you may need somebody who can just kind of specialize in one of those super complex agents.
If that happens, by the way, I would predict the region to do it first would be Korea, because the other advantage, like I alluded to when I was setting Achilios up here, was one of the crazy things about Korean mentality is, because it really is about being the best, right? They have a very unique mentality compared to Westerners, right? A Westerners mentality goes like this: if I can't be on the top team, I'm not going to be a sub for the top team. I'll go play for the second best team and try and beat them, or I'll try and join their team one day as a starter. In Korea, for real, if you are a big org, people will join your org who are really good players, be a sub, and just hope they get a starter spot one day. So they're actually, for real, you could have scenarios where that guy should be on the 3rd best team. Why is he on this team? But he would just stay as a sub and hope, he gets put in the game. So I could easily see people being willing, if there's a mega OP agent and they're just specialising on, I could see people doing it. I don't think it's great myself, but the Koreans would be the ones to do it, I think.
I mean, think about EasyHoon. EasyHoon sat there in the background with Faker for the longest time. Yes. He was just kind of just the second best bid in the region at that time.
He was pretty good, yeah.
You could go toe-to-toe with basically anybody. He could have absolutely moved on to KT Rolster or to any of these other teams, but he's just like, I'll chill right here. It's fine.
That's also one thing, by the way, about Valorant. Maybe we'll make this the last topic. It's a bit of an abstract topic, but I'd like to get your thoughts. I'd like your thoughts of first, Gio, which is one thing that I think makes Valorant very unique as an esport is, you know, when I did the whole thing I said before, that balance in the other games is based on, like in CSGO, you essentially balance the game with maps. Like the map is what changes, the character stays the same. And in League of Legends, there's only one map and the character changes. That's what changes. Like, the thing that I think is going to make Valorant potentially really wonky meta-wise is your bans are for the maps. You don't do the fucking agent bans, which is the equivalent of the League of Legends like character bans. So the problem is you can't keep stuff out the game that's OP. Now, here's the thing. I love that because I always used to say the thing that was so whack coming from like Quake and Counter-Strike to League of Legends is I remember what someone once explaining to me why they do the bans. I was like, so wait a minute. So he's too good on that. So we don't ever get to see him play it. What the fuck is this? Like some sort of fuck like BDSM esport? Like I want to see him play the shit he's really good at. Like what the fuck? Who's ruining the game? But the joke is in Valorant, like you can't stop someone. If someone's the best on that agent, you have to just deal with it. You know?
Yeah, I do wonder if like maybe if there are more agents down the line, if it's something they would introduce. Rainbow Six has both map bans and operator bans.
Right.
So you get to ban two attack. Each team gets to ban one attacker and one defender. And at this point, there are a lot of operators, and so there are a lot of people who want there to be an option for a third ban now. I think it's getting to that time in Rainbow Six, but obviously we don't know if that's something that they will bring into Valorant. I think it's a really interesting point, and actually one that I'd thought about before is like, yeah, everybody has the option to do it, and I think the really curious thing for me about the development of Valorant and development of like competitive Valorant that will sort of play into whether that is a good or a bad thing is currently a lot of teams do kind of follow the same trend. Like it's like you could be a team who's like, okay, that like this team, you know, everything they play, they use an Astra for. Like, let's go back up patch. They use an Astra for. Oh shit, but we use an Astra for everything as well. So like, okay. So it could be forced variety in that sense, in that like people, like teams have to deviate from just following this very core idea of the correct way to compose like a team to play, because you know, the strong agents for team A are going to be the strong agents for team B for the most part, but it could also just be like, you know, not for the same reason, like not a actually very good idea, because then I think that if it were introduced, for a while there would be teams who look really good but then don't look so good because they're forced out of this comfort zone, but then actually kind of adapt to that. It's just about, for me, I think, whether or not there would be a ton of variety in how those bans go. Like if you watch a League of Legends game, whether or not you like the draft, like usually the drafts have some uniqueness to them. Like you watch, you watch a game. You watch the draft for that game, you move on to the next game, the draft for the next game is going to look different. And I think also what comes into that with League of Legends, though, is that like if you're playing a champion, the enemy team can't play like that same champion.
True.
So that comes in, which obviously isn't the case in Valorant.
Yes, that's a good point.
And that's actually written into the lore of Valorant, so that's not going to change. I think that's part of the story of the game.
The most important part about competitive games.
Absolutely.
I know, that's the part I never know about.
Competitive games. But my point is like, if that's written into the lore of the game, it's very, very unlikely to change. It's not really that I give a shit about that. So I don't know if we would have like that same sort of situation where you get like a ton of unique picks. And that is kind of to relate it to Rainbow Six again, like that's a problem that Rainbow Six is sort of faced, where there'll be a couple of like operators who for a really long time will be insta bans. It doesn't matter who you are. Right. Because they're just such strong. They're just too good. And then what ends up happening is teams get so used to that being banned that they stop scrimming with that operator in their composition, and then you start to see a meta shift because teams don't need to ban it anymore because no one's fucking scrimming with the operator, and you can start to bring new ones. But you don't have like quite as rapid a change as you see in League of Legends. So I think that if it were something that they brought into Valorant, it would have to take those things into account, and I would hope that it would, if anything, like force some diversity and actually kind of throw some teams off the beaten track and have a kind of loose meta, but not like a really, we must follow this to the letter kind of meta, which I think is fair to say it kind of has been in its lifetime so far.
I think the reason I'm very much fine with just kind of maintaining the current system, just keep map bans, not have any kind of agent draft, is I think to a certain extent, like if you start implementing, especially on the non-esports side, like if you wanted to just have an agent pick ban, I suppose, for esports and not have it included in like competitive play, that's one approach. But as soon as you start bringing that to the core game, one of the things that I think that might do is really start fucking with the power level that we see agents come out with, because you kind of see it with League of Legends, like as things come out, they're really fucking broken because they're just like, well, people just ban it until we fix it and then we fine tune it and whatnot. Whereas like so far, everything's been pretty good. I'd say on the Valorant front, when an agent comes out, there maybe has been some like overtunes in the patch notes, but as far as like the actual release of a character, everything has felt pretty good. Like you read maybe their kit and it looks like perhaps they're going to be kind of like busted, must pick this character type deal, but then in execution, they have never really felt that way. I don't know. Maybe I'm alone in this, but like I'd say the closest to just like kind of busted that we've seen is maybe Chamber. But even then, like he's not a must pick by any means on any map. Like he's still nowhere near as prevalent as Jett is. So for like a new release character, for him to have as much value as he's had, but still not be like this predominant must pick agent, I think it's a good sign. My cat just hopped over my mic. I think it's a good sign for the game's development. I'm curious that if there were to, put in this pick and ban, if that would affect the mentality of the developers and how they're approaching character design at all, just on a base level. Because you might feel like you can get away with a lot more since people can ban it away. So maybe you just overhaul something at the start and then you work your way down, rather than have things come out on a bit more of a level playing field from the start.
I will say I notice, just as an outsider, all the times I ever saw people crying on Reddit about things being like broken and busted, it was always just all the fucking champions that all the carry players play, you idiots. Like, that's just the player that's busted, you idiots. Like, if people don't know, people in CSGO, some people actually still try to complain that the AWP is overpowered. It isn't. It's just the weapon that the best players use. So what happens is when the guy who's like fucking the Michael Jordan of the game uses it, guess what? A lot of his moves look fucking OP in basketball. They're actually the hardest moves to do. A turnaround, fade away, jump shot. Like, that's it. That's not a broken move. It's far from it. So because by the way, whenever I used to read Reddit, it's like for a year they were like, Jett is still broken. I was like, what are you talking about? Like, people lose with this all the time. Like, doesn't everyone just use it?
I was just going to say the only weapon that I can think of, at least in my time in Valorant, that did need like bringing down was the Judge. Like, that was the weapon that had legitimate complaints.
The shotguns have always been a little bit, for sure. But I was going to say, I think the only part of a kit realistically that I can think of that was broken was Beta Raze when she had 2 grenades by default. I think that's probably the most broken circumstance I can think of for a single character. But otherwise, like, things have widely been pretty good and then pretty easy to adjust. Like Raze, obviously, like you had to cut the number of grenades in half, just give her 1, and then she gets a refresh off 2 kills. But everything else has just been like, oh, just move the numbers up by 2 or 3, move them down by 2 or 3, whatever. Like, it hasn't been major swooping changes where something was so busted that it had to be patched like ASAP. And I think that's a really good sign so far.
Sure. I did also just want to add, like, off the back of your previous point that you were talking about with like balancing new agents and stuff, is I do agree with you that I actually think that not having bans, at least right now, is like proven to be a pretty good thing. And I think that the other thing that I suppose my original point kind of alluded to, but not necessarily in this context, is that when you do start bringing in like agent bans and whatever, you see a lot more swings in the meta that then you are not just balancing against, like when you bring in new agents, for example, you're not just balancing against the available agent pool, but you're balancing against like how people are banning, right? Because it could be like, okay, everyone's banning, like it's a really popular ban right now to ban Agent A. So when we bring in this new person, it's kind of to specifically counter like the ban meta right now, and also like we need to tune them to be towards that. And then when that starts to change and people start to play differently, that new agent, who's now not new anymore, will actually need to have a bunch of their shit changed because they've been specifically brought in to counter a meta that is no longer meta. And then you get much bigger waves and bigger changes needed, and it becomes much harder to balance. So I think it's kind of like, you know, very, very similar to the point that you were making. But I just wanted to add that because I think that is a very like relevant and reasonable point, is you actually have a lot like smoother waters with no agent ban, because you like any new agents that are coming in or any changes, reworks that they make to any of the agents is against like a consistent pool where it's kind of fair game for anyone.
Yeah, sure. We're seeing adjustments like that for the Overwatch League as well. I mean, they're talking about, you know, no hero pools and whatnot, and this is coming off the back of, you know, a major overhaul. We're anticipating all of these characters, you know, I'd say probably have the majority of their identity intact from Overwatch 1, but we've already, you know, heard about some swooping changes and whatnot. So you can expect that everything's going to come out, be balanced for an open pool, and then it's just going to stay that way. So all of the agents come in, and you just basically have to weigh a new character in Overwatch or a new character in Valorant against the current power level of all of the agents that are out there, because everybody's available. Say, what can this guy do? What can this guy do? How do we make this, you know, agent stand out but not be more broken than any of these other things? And I think that that's a really healthy way to be approaching it. So I'm glad that the game is in that position. Whether or not we ever get to the point where a pick and ban system for agents is necessary, I think that, you know, I think we're probably years away from that occurring. I don't know how many more agents.
How many agents is there at the moment? Like, what's the number?
Oh, God,
well, roughly, we're talking guesstimate here. What we,
you know, 16, 17-ish?
Right, if people don't know, I think in League of Legends there's like 150 different characters now. So to be fair, because the same thing obviously was a similar concept in Overwatch, I don't know if there's enough agents yet that you'd need it, right? Wouldn't you need like sort of closer to 100? Do you really need it right now?
Looks like 18 currently.
There's 18? There's only 18? Holy moly. I think you're miles away then. You probably need to have like 40 or 50 before you're going to do this approach. Yeah,
I think it would be a while. I think you could do it before then, but I think it would still be in the ballpark of like 30-ish would maybe be when that's the case. But again, it all comes down to the power creep as well.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, that is the key difference. This video was kindly supported by Ahmed Hadjou, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Travis Goff, Adam Ochs, Animosity, Bot Pounder 420, Hades, Jensen Goh, Joseph Ginsburg, Kovacevicd, Tobias Bernasconi, Thooorin, William Peyton Lacy, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and as always, special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Want to ask me a question in my monthly AMA? Do you want teasers? Find out who the upcoming guests are? Maybe you want to take part in a lengthy donator discussion with me? Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Skilluminati today, where? Via the Patreon link in the description box.